Hello, friends and colleagues. My name is Sherry Bishop, and I'm so pleased to be a presenter at the 2020 Virginia Montessori Association Virtual Conference. Our title this year, Montessori Action for Equity, is so appropriate. ACT meaning acknowledge, contemplate, and transform. And I really hope that the information that I'm going to share with you today will prompt you to do all of those things. Let's get started. The title of my presentation is Acknowledging Our Historical Truth, a Necessary Path to Reconciliation. If you have come to this presentation and are excited about the information, then I applaud you. Your willingness to investigate and face some harsh historical truths about how and why our nation continues to struggle with bigotry, prejudice, and discrimination, anti-Blackness, and overt racism is a step toward really engaging in anti-racist work. The historical truths about the relationship between the descendants of the original indigenous and African peoples and the descendants of white colonists is not pretty. However, it must be mutually acknowledged, appreciated, and honored before our society can move toward reconciliation, equity, justice, and peace. If you have not already done so, I ask you to watch the Teaching Tolerance Hard History videos concerning Indigenous and African enslavement in America. As a matter of fact, I'm going to ask you to back out of this presentation and view those supplemental videos. I guarantee that you will have a different perspective and a deeper and more thoughtful and more a deeper understanding of the information that I'm going to present to you in the presentation. So there are actually 10 different videos, and there are links to it in the books. Each video is only about 5 minutes. The one about the indigenous slavery is about 12 minutes. So the total viewing time is about 1 hour. So I encourage you to do that before you listen to this presentation. Acknowledging our historical truth. Forgive me as I find a space for myself so you can see the screen. Anti-bias and anti-racist work is often stated as one particular aggregate of work, a type of work that we're moving towards. But anti-bias work can be very different from anti-racist work. In anti-bias work, there is much emphasis and effort on self, preparing oneself to enter and engage in this work. For you, that means that you may have been included in discussions, reflections, you've done some research about your family and your history and how you've assimilated into this country if you were not a natural born citizen. The aim of the work is to interrogate your own personal biases and adverse behaviors and to recognize how they can lead to policies and decisions that disadvantage Black, Indigenous, and people of color. You may have run across some important shared vocabulary, such as what are your personal identities? What are your social identities? What intersectionalities do you have? How have you assimilated into your world? You may have spent some time interrogating your biases and understanding what stereotypes, microaggressions, and your personal history is, and how you fit into this nation. And hopefully you've also had the opportunity to study the history of the land that we are living on. On the other hand, anti-racist work may take a different approach. Structural racism, after bias, is the second force that contributes to racial human rights violations, inequities, injustices, and exclusivity. Our aim in anti-racist work is to fully understand the concept of racism and anti-Blackness, and how they came to be the guiding forces in our U.S. society today. It's imperative that we understand how American indigenous slavery was a precursor to African American slavery, or African slavery in America. It's imperative that you understand how the transatlantic slave trade shaped our country and how its legacy continues to shape just about every institution and aspect of life. And we want to understand how American slavery continues to shape not just the institutions, but the fundamental beliefs of Americans about race, and how white supremacy emerged as a legacy of the slave enterprise. So you may find that there's some other important vocabulary, and we will talk about some of these definitions. But during the course, we'll talk about Native American enslavement, African American enslavement, prejudice, discrimination, bigotry, white supremacism, domestic white terrorism, and all these other terms that are listed. So we'll move forward. Before engaging in anti-racist work, it's important that we acknowledge and understand our American history, even the most tragic and inhumane parts. This knowledge is what's going to move us forward. Our history is a shared history. We know that there are parts of American history that may highlight the indigenous people, or there are parts of history where we put emphasis on African people, or even colonialism and the colonists. However, there is only one American history, and there are few events that happened in this nation where all people were not involved. And so I just want to talk about a few myths that we have. These are some of the myths that are even taught to our children in schools. And these may be myths that you believe because of such limited education that we've had about others other than colonialists in America. I love this quote from James Baldwin. He calls it the great white myth. What passes for identity in America is a series of myths about one's heroic ancestors. It is astounding to me, for example, that so many people really appear to believe that the country was founded by a band of heroes who wanted to be free. But in fact, The band of heroes were elite men that lacked leadership skills. They were wealthy men that lacked the work ethic that such a demanding endeavor required. I live in the Hampton Roads area, very close, maybe less than an hour's drive to Jamestown in historic Williamsburg, and have been there many times. Jamestown Colony almost failed because the Virginia Company, who were sponsoring the colonists, made a poor choice when they decided where to establish it. And they were unable to successfully work together. They established the colony on the peninsula with horrible soil. And so things grew it was difficult to really grow things that they were familiar with. The colony was a success because it survived due to tobacco and the fact that the local indigenous tribes were not able to destroy it because they were suffering from starvation and illness brought on by the colonists. In fact, this new nation was established to be a money-making enterprise. The sole goal was not freedom. It was to be a profitable business. Free labor by enslaved people made the business extremely profitable and made the colonists very rich. So this is the truth. The United States of America was established as a white society. It's in the historical record that it was founded upon the enslavement and near genocide of one race, and then centuries of enslavement of yet another. And each time I talk about this topic, or I'm sure you may have experienced it as well as you've entered topics about American slavery, these are some things that typically pop up. And so I want to acknowledge these different ideas or thoughts before we move on. I want you to know that I'm aware of them and that there are some truths to some of these acknowledgments. So one of the things that I want you to know that's important, and I'm sure you already know this, that prior to indigenous and transatlantic slavery enterprises, many other nations practiced slavery. And it's not a new inhumane activity. Human slavery is human slavery, and though it existed, it is not moral, nor is it humane. Slavery did exist in African nations among warring tribes, and yes, there were small fractions that did support the transatlantic slave trade. With colonization came the enslavement of indigenous peoples, and their enslavement stretched from Alaska to South America. It predated and helped shape the system of African enslavement in New England, and it lasted until throughout the 19th century in the West. Before there was African slavery, especially in the South, there were a small number of Africans that were wealthy and prosperous and thriving in what is known as North America. Enslavement based on race was insidious and progressive over decades. And as the progression occurred, these people that were free and wealthy, their land was taken away, their wealth was taken away, and their freedom was taken away. Wealth and prosperity of African nations were interrupted by European theft of vital and natural resources. And finally, colonial settlers created the most brutal, most violent system of chattel slavery in the world. They redefined the relationship between the slaveholder and the enslaved in a way that the world had not yet experienced. The concepts of dehumanization and anti-Blackness were the basis upon which this system was built and sustained. And chattel slavery means that once one person is a slave, that they can never be free. Their children will never be free. Their children's children will never be free. No matter how hard they worked, there would be perpetual slavery in the family. I'm encouraging you to go back and, if you haven't already, watch the key concepts about African slavery, the videos that are really give some great information. Slavery is something that you can study for an entire course or for an entire degree. It's that much information that is to be had. However, these videos give you simply the basic concepts of what happened during the period of slavery in the United States. So teaching hard history concept videos, the scholars and historians explore the key concept of the business and practices of chattel slavery. Excuse me. They reveal the significant negative impact of enslavement on the lives of African people and revealed how new nations developed and prospered around the institution of slavery. At one time, the slave business was a $3 billion business. If you were to use, to count that in today's terms or financial terms. And it was one of the greatest economic enterprises in the United States. And so they also talk about how enslaved people influence the economy, politics, social, cultural policies and practices, and how it perpetuated and continues to perpetuate white supremacism and internalized white privilege. So I'm going to go over those, what I just mentioned were the key concepts of slavery, but there are some key points about African slavery, the lived experiences, and I've taken the liberty to compare the contemporary lifestyle that many African American people have. And I compared that to the key points about African slavery. Of course, historically, the key point in African slavery was the lack of independence. Of course, enslaved people could not decide whether to work, where to work, how to work, what to eat, when to eat, sleep, or the ability to experience much outside of the land on which they worked. Their days were from sunup to sundown and often longer. And it consisted of maybe a few minutes of eating and a few minutes of social life, but mostly it involved work. If you know someone that is 65 to 70 years old, they were alive during the Jim Crow era as we were coming out, and the civil rights activity was really high around the 1960s. So the information that I'm going to share with you is, when I say contemporary, I'm talking about 2 to 3 generations ago. And a generation can usually be considered 20 years. So we're talking about 60 years ago when our nation fought its way out of Jim Crow and the absolute segregation to the way that things are now. So if you know somebody that's 75, definitely if you know somebody that's 80 years old, they have experienced some just traumatic racism and segregation in this nation. So once we are free, African Americans still could not, 60 or 2 to 3 generations ago, still could not decide where to work, where to eat, where to live, where to go to school, if they could exercise the right to vote, and how they traveled around the country. We were said to be free, and legislation was passed, but there were still many unwritten rules and still a lot of practices that disadvantage African Americans. We had limited access to colleges. We had, I remember being in middle school before the schools were actually integrated in Virginia. And that was the first time that I'd been to a school that was not totally Black, Black students and Black staff and principals and teachers. There was an inability to control their own lives. Historically, enslaved people could not decide on their own careers, could not decide on whom to marry, or how to maintain their family and relationships intact. There was no way out of slavery, even for children, no matter how hard one worked. And 2 or 3 generations ago, free African Americans could not, for the most part, decide on their careers. Usually the opportunities for men were to be preachers, or there were educated men that often ended up working as train porters, and women, even though they were educated, often worked as domestics and maybe teachers or nurses in the Black healthcare system. But many careers and opportunities were still not available to African Americans. And many people, though they had training and education, found themselves trapped in menial positions with little potential for advancement. And until the Loving case, there were limits on whom one could marry. African American slavery was wrought with extreme violence. Enslaved people suffered brutality, whippings, dismembering of bodies, murders, public lynching, mass incarceration because of things like pig laws. That means that there was something simple like stealing a pig could put you in jail for life. In contemporary America, we're still experiencing police brutality, extreme sentencing, mass incarceration, the criminalization of children, and white supremacism is rooted in violence and white domestic terrorism. And many of you may have heard about a man that was recently released from jail after being sentenced for life, but after serving 23 years for stealing some hedge clippers. This is in our time today. Historically, slavery created a sense of Black racial inferiority that most white people believed. And some Black people also believed. Everything that white people did in front of Africans were to make them recognize that the opulence and the richness and the opportunity was only available for white people. And only certain Black people were deemed worthy to be in the white spaces. And within the last 2 to 3 generations ago and now, today we have gated communities and mansions in the presence of Black people. Even when they own property in these elite areas are questioned by the police, even when they're trying to even enter their own homes. Many Black people struggle with a sense of racial inferiority and grapple with colorism and dual consciousness. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. So the enslavement of African people in the New World was the catalyst for structural racism as we know it today. Many people question if it was racism that perpetuated enslavement of Black people, or the enslavement was the catalyst for racism. And this fundamental statement is the basis for historical racism, continued racial injustice, and anti-Blackness and racial inequality in America. Enslavement was the catalyst for racism. So what is structural racism? It's a complex ways that history, policies, practices, almost every aspect of life and cultural representations interact to maintain a racial hierarchy, with whites being usually at the top and Blacks being perceived to be at the bottom and everyone else in between. And this hierarchy perpetuates and allows privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color. Now, to enter into this anti-racist work, we need to enter it with rational thinking. So for white people, to me, rational thinking is to understand that those living today, we know, did not actually participate in enslavement of indigenous and African people. However, the legacy of slavery continues to positively impact and advantage the lives of white people. So guilt, whether or not guilt exists or not, that's something that each of those who entertain that feeling will have to deal with. For indigenous and Black people, it is rational thinking to understand that those living today were not actually enslaved. However, the legacy of slavery continues to negatively impact and disadvantage the lives of indigenous and Black people. And we should not feel ashamed. And if we are experiencing that feeling, that's something that we have to overcome. Now, with that being said, though white people were not responsible, white people today are not responsible for enslaving people, nor Black people today or indigenous people today were not a part of the enslaved group, we are not off the moral hook. White people are still accountable for the legacy and continued perpetuation of racism. So we, all of us, especially white people, are responsible for treating people fairly, without racism, and for treating slavery honestly, without sugarcoating and using euphemisms from here on for the rest of our lives, because we are aware of what happened and we are aware of what we can do to make it not happen. So this is some of the language when we study anti-racism versus anti-bias work. And so I'll go over a few of these. So prejudice and bigotry are usually personal notions. These are what people feel as individuals. They may feel it about a person or a group of people. And bigotry is unreasonable. Prejudice is also unreasonable or an irrational attachment to the negative stereotypes and prejudices. And these are things that you hold as individuals. But when discrimination comes in place, the denial of justice and fair treatment by individuals and institutions in many arenas, it is usually an action that can follow prejudice and thinking, and it's usually done within the confines of an institution, such as an educational setting, during housing and banking and politics. So white supremacism, and that is a word, it's a belief, just like racism is a belief. And it can also be an action. It's an historically based, institutionally perpetuated system supported by the belief that white people are the superior race and everything should be centered around them, and they dominate society. And this is to the detriment or exclusion of other people and groups, particularly Black people and Jewish people. And when we put that into action, it is what, so white supremacy is the belief. White supremacism is when we put that belief into action. And historically, our nation is a web of interlocking, reinforcing institutions, whether it's economic institutions, military, the judicial system, religion, even in religious sectors. This is where white supremacy is operated. So as a system, white supremacy affects just about every aspect of life in this country. So when the belief and the actions are threatened, when white supremacy is threatened and white supremacism is being utilized within institutions, white domestic terrorism is often employed to control both of those things. I'm sorry, I'm having to move around here. So the United States, the United States Department of Homeland Security has drafted their assessment and evaluation for the year 2020. It's not been published yet, but this draft document is stated by John Cohen from the Department of Homeland Security, seems to be consistent with earlier intelligence reports from the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI and other law enforcement resources, that today the most significant terror-related threat facing the United States today comes from violent extremists who are motivated by white supremacy and other far-right ideological causes. So it is not groups like social justice groups and Black Lives Matter. This is what it's facing, or even these Antifa groups. It is white supremacy. What is internalized white privilege? It's definitely less overt than white supremacy, but it still can be very oppressive. And this definition comes from Peggy McIntosh in her book, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And she describes white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets, which I can count on cashing in each day. I, of course, meaning Peggy, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. So it's sort of just a natural instinct, that an unawareness, but a definitely a powerful advantage. I love this definition by the American Academy of Pediatrics, and this was published in July 2019. And it was intended to talk about the impact of racism on children and adolescents, but it certainly can be used, and that idea can be extrapolated for all of us. So racism is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on social interpretation, of course, of how we look. And it unfairly disadvantages some individuals, unfairly advantages others. And I love that they say it saps the strength out of our whole society through the waste of human resources. Such energy is put into hatred and disadvantaging people, rather than us pulling together as a nation and combining all our potential and all our skills and assets to make this a great nation. I also like this because it really echoes that racism is not something that we're born with, it's something that we're taught. It's something that's perpetuated. And racism is a socially transmitted disease passed down through generations, leading to the inequities observed in our population today. So if you know what racism is, so what is anti-racism? And many people have been very involved in reading the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And in his book, he defines anti-racism as the support of anti-racist policies, their actions, or an expression of ideas based on anti-racism. But I love this definition by the Alberto Civil Liberties Research Center. A person who's anti-racist is one who practices anti-racism and who works to become aware of these things. And I think I like this definition because it actually gives us some outcomes. We all can say that we're anti-racist, or we believe in anti-racism, but this definition is giving us something to work towards as individuals. So if you're anti-racist, you're one who would want to become aware of how racism affects the lived experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. You would want to be aware of people and how they're living and not make assumptions about that, or not go on stereotypes about it. You would want to be aware of how racism is systemic and has been part of many foundational aspects of society throughout history, and can be manifested in both individual attitudes and behaviors, as well as formal policies and practices within institutions. And you want to be aware of how white people participate how you participate, whether it's knowingly or unknowingly, in racist behaviors. Racism is a word that can be um, applied to many experiences, and those experiences can be lived by many different groups. But anti-Blackness is a, a, a concept that's really related to people that are Black, or groups of people where there can be subgroups of Black people within the community. So the term racism fails to capture what Black people in this country experience in its totality, because Blackness is tied to slaveness. U.S. chattel slavery continues to mark the position of Black people. Remember, I talked about usually it was the perception that white people were the superior race and Black people were the most inferior race, and everybody else was in between. Anti-Blackness is a manifestation of our society's inability to recognize the humanity in Black people. There is still a lot of hatred, disdain, even disgust that remains very real, and lessons, again, whether they're taught knowingly or unknowingly, perpetuate, continues to perpetuate this sentiment in the United States and in other places. So if there's no anti-Blackness, if anti-Blackness did not exist, there could be little white supremacy or supremacism, little white power, and little white privilege. And I think the other group of people that this is directed to are Jewish people. So that's why I quantify by saying little, because there's certainly some supremacy and white power and privilege that is being it is active toward other groups of people. So if you watched the concept videos, you probably were shocked at some of the things that were talked about in the videos. And we can think, how do rational human beings perpetuate such atrocities toward another group of human beings? But people mold their ideas to rationalize their answers, their actions. For slaveholders to subject the enslaved to these unthinkable brutality and just trauma, they as human beings had to emotionally and psychologically create an inner belief about Black people that was far distant from their beliefs about their own people. They had to be able to make the African person a person that they could not relate to on a human level. So one could not give away a family's children or separate a family until they created a belief that African people or indigenous people had no emotional attachments to one another. They did not perceive themselves as family units, as loving parents, or as children that love their parents and parents that love their children. They could not have worked them like animals from sunup to sundown without relating them to, not to people, but to animals that have physical power and strength. They could not have done experiments on people without anesthesia, particularly on women, if they did not believe that Black people did not feel deep pain. Or they could not work them 16, 18 hours a day if they believed that Black people couldn't live without adequate sleep. And they definitely could not just murder them without feeling that they were not spiritual beings. So this is how anti-Blackness was perpetuated. And that anti-Blackness is real today. Many of you have seen this experiment where dolls and pictures are shown to both children, Black and white children, and they're asked some questions, some affirming questions, and some not so affirming questions. And the children will point to the child that they feel like best represents the notion. For instance, when questions were asked, who is the mean child? This white child points to the darkest child. Who is the child that is not smart? The same happens. Who is the child that's not pretty? The same happens. And this happened over and over again. But the sad part about it, and when we talk about inferiority and the belief that Black people are inferior and that some Black people hold that same notion, the sad part about this study is when these same questions were asked to Black children, they too pointed to the darkest child. So I just want to cover quickly, when we talked about anti-Blackness is very complicated. And there's this whole other discrimination that happens within the same race. And colorism is one of them. It's a prejudicial or preferential treatment of same race people based solely on their skin color. And usually those that have lighter skin get the preference. And it's not just a problem within the African community, within the African American community, or in other Black communities around the world. It is very prevalent and a problem around the world, including in Latin America, where you have Latinx people that present Black and white, in East and Southeast Asia, and in the Caribbean and Africa. And evidence of this is the tons and tons of skin whitening cream that's sold around the world. It is, the business is worth billions of dollars of people just using this product to lighten their skin. And then there's also this notion of dual consciousness. And this is not only within the African or African American communities, these are also in the same communities that I just mentioned. It's where others that are non-white live in a society that can be oppressive and devalues them as equals. And we know this happens on at different levels for different groups. But at the same, and particularly this happens when we're talking about African Americans, we know that we are living in an oppressive state. And at the same time, the African American families and cultures instill and encourage equality and dignity. So on one hand, you have your culture and your family and your ancestors and your descendants, we're all saying, you know, we are valuable people. We are worthy of freedom. We are worthy of equity. And then on the other hand, this world society that we're living in is sending us the message that we are not as valued, that we are not going to be afforded equity. And so we develop this type of double consciousness, which forces us to view ourselves through two different lenses. We are trying to navigate this world through the white lens, and then also navigate through the lens of our culture. So it makes it difficult for us to, or other groups as well, to identify or unify their subcultures with the overall American identity. And so, you know, I'm Hindu, but you know, the world in America is based on Christian values. So that's a conflict. So what's the approach to engaging in anti-racist work? So the approach is going to be different than it was in the 1960s. We're in a different revolution. We're in a different racial revolution, and our demands are quite different. In the 60s, civil rights movement was a struggle to eliminate segregation and establish equal rights under the law. But we know that legislation does not change the hearts and minds of people. And it doesn't necessarily even change policy and practices, because people can circumvent these policies and practices that were supposed to be legislated. In our current social justice movements, they aim to gain universal equity, and we want accountability, change. When people are making these equity statements and anti-bias and anti-racist statements, they're wonderful. But I would like to go back in a year, and hopefully we could document progress within those institutions that are being very verbal about their solidarity and unity with the Black community at this point. So this will require conscious change in thought processes and paradigms which currently limit thinking and action. So I challenge anyone who's engaging in this anti-racist work to cultivate the capacity to stay in the conversation without using euphemisms and sugarcoating what has happened in our history or sugarcoating what is happening now. It takes courage not to avoid difficult topics about race. And this is the work that belongs to all of us. Engage with a safe, trusting, diverse group to gain different perspectives. I put myself out to do anti-bias and anti-racist work to other groups because I found myself going to organizational meetings and conferences and things where everybody was like-minded, and it was like singing to the choir. But I want to touch and make progress with those who may not hold my particular views. And it's up to me, and I want to be a teacher. I want to be a trailblazer on behalf of this anti-racist, anti-bias work. So go outside of your comfort zone and engage with people that may not be as like-minded with you, because when you don't do that, you're limiting your knowledge, and there will not be much forward thinking. Acknowledge and stay within the historical context that has shaped our current reality. To avoid repeating the past mistakes, try to understand all the parts of our history. Every single part of it is American history, even the worst parts of our history, even the parts you feel uncomfortable with, even the parts that you can't fathom, even the parts that are the legacy of what we're experiencing today. So read, study, talk, read, study, talk, read, study, talk. And this is a personal challenge to accept the responsibility for considering how you are a part of upholding racism and white supremacism. Interrogate your personal bias, beliefs, and behaviors and how you interact within your social and professional systems. Commit yourself to the work of helping to undo them. And this is, again, this is all of our work. If I, in my family, is perpetuating the idea of colorism, then I'm being complicit in this whole complex system of racism. Oh, sorry. We often wonder if we lived centuries ago and you were in the center of this tragic time and place, what would I do or have done to improve the conditions? Because we all believe that we would carry the righteous banner and we would do something to stop the atrocities and the trauma and that was going on. But the answer probably is this, that you would be, whatever you would, the same thing you are doing now to improve the conditions of probably the same thing you would have been doing back then. So ask yourself, if I were not afraid, what do I want to do? Knowing that you'll make mistakes, you'll say the wrong thing, you may not know all the facts and all the figures, but that's okay. It's not about perfection, it's about progress. So do it anyway. Just do something. It can be something as simple of informing someone that you do not appreciate a racial joke or a racial slur. Thanksgiving and Christmas is coming up. You're going to have a lot of opportunities. So what you can do to dismantle structural racism. There are 4 types of changes that must occur in the way we live and navigate society as individuals in order for change to occur. To improve, there must be an internal change to improve race relations and outcomes in all aspects and establish racial equity as a central tenet and operating principles in our lives. That goes back to doing all the self interrogations and just reading and being aware of what's going on, being informed. There needs to be strategic change. Things must change if things are going to change. Understand that each of us has some power, but we must understand the extent of our personal power within the arenas in which we operate, whether it be at church, on your job, in your home, as the matriarch or patriarch of your family. So you do have personal power, but you must strategize how to best put it to use to facilitate justice and equity within the society. Practice change. Once you realize how things need to be changed, you must practice that. Focus carefully on all the ways in which standard practices in your life reproduce, perpetuate, or fail to counteract negative outcomes that disadvantage people. And then there must be some cultural change. Us working to reframe and change stereotypical images, how we interpret those images. One example I have is how people, how African American people, especially African American men, are depicted on television, especially during this time of protesting. Um, they're often called thugs and hoodlums and looters. And there was a college, a white college group of students who were looting and turning over cars and burning cars and buildings. And the media reported it as just a party gone wrong. You know, these were not thugs, they were just active college students excited about what happened at the game. And so even though the results and the damage was the same, the way the media reported those situations were totally different. And those are the kinds of things that we have to be aware of and know that we have to interpret it for ourselves. Finally, I challenge you to explore some accessible resources. This one is extremely easy to read, and it's very comprehensive. If you live in Virginia, go to the Mount Pelier Museum. There's a great exhibit. Of course, there's an African American Museum in Washington, D.C. But, there's also some great information at the Mount Pelier website, 6 Ways That Understanding Slavery Will Change How You Understand American Freedom. And I think that's an excellent read. Finally, if you have questions, comments, things that you want to share, please join me on Saturday, November 14th, 2020 at 12 noon for the live question and answer session. I'll be there and anxious to hear what you have to say. And remember to get your full CEUs for any presentations that you view. You must view the presentation as well as participate in the live Q&A session to get your full CEU for this particular presentation. I thank you. I know this has probably been a bit long, but I really wanted to give you some information for thought and for information for you to acknowledge, contemplate, and transform. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing. And I hope you all get to view all of the wonderful presentations and the offerings on this virtual conference. And I thank the VMA board for inviting me to speak. And I hope you guys donate for the Black Montessori Educational Fund. That's a worthwhile endeavor. And I hope you listen to the interview that I did with Dr. Ayize Savitar. And so continue to have a great year. And I look forward to hearing from you during the live Q&A. Thank you. Bye-bye.